How could her body have ended up in the Everglades, but there's no footage of her ever leaving the hotel? This case is terrible from the beginning. On an early morning in February in Miami, it is a chilly day and a woman is found face down floating in the tall grass and mud of the Everglades. Someone comes across the body and immediately assumes she's dead. Her long hair is floating there. She's face down. How could she not be dead? But they still check on her, and to their surprise, she is alive, barely clinging to life. So the police are called and they immediately medevac her. When she wakes up in the hospital, she barely remembers a thing, but there is a ton of physical evidence. She is badly beaten. She was obviously SA'd and raped. There is male DNA, if you know what I mean, on her body. She has severe brain and head trauma. Her bones over her right eye are fractured and broken completely. She had a thick accent and spoke in broken English. It clearly wasn't her first language, and so it's kind of hard sometimes for them to understand her. But essentially she says that she barely remembers anything, and everything that she does remember is kind of fuzzy. She says that she remembers someone, maybe 2 or 3 white men, breaking into her room, shoving a pillow on her face, making her drink something. She doesn't remember seeing them, but she remembers tasting something like strong alcoholic. And then she kind of remembers being slung over someone's shoulder and carried downstairs. And then at some point she remembers being in a car, and in the car she was violated and harassed, and she remembers pleading for her life. But what she's remembering is in bits and pieces, and it's really hard for her to give any sort of leading evidence or anything that could identify who really did this. So detectives learned that this girl had been living at the airport hotel for months. It was only 8 miles from where she was found floating. The reason she was at the hotel is because she worked for a cruise line. While she was on the job, she got injured. So while she was healing, the job had put her up in a hotel. The police look at her room for evidence, they look at surveillance footage, and they interview staff. And the hotel had almost 200 rooms and it was very busy, so it was hard to really get any leads. Her and her lawyer end up suing the hotel for negligence, and they end up hiring a private detective named Ken Brennan to find out what happened, because the police at this point were not being very helpful. So Ken Brennan is now involved, and he gets with the lead detective on the case. His name is Alan Foote. And so Ken and Alan are talking, and Ken is like, I'm not going to get in your way, but I'm going to figure out what happened, and I will go through you. I'll make sure that everything I'm doing, since I'm technically not a police officer, I'm just a PI, I will make sure everything I'm doing goes through you, and if I have anything, you can make the arrest. I'm not going to get in your way, but I'm figuring this out. And Detective Alan Foote, he was pretty helpful, like he was interested in the case, but at some point when a case dries up and there's no leads, he does have to move on to other cases. So he tells him, go ahead, he gives him some evidence and like gives him some of the files, but he says, I can't keep helping you, like I have to move on to new things. So Ken looks into this case and he is looking at the hotel security system. It was pretty extensive. There was 2 security guards on duty at all times. The back doors were locked at night, and each exit had a security camera. There was also one at the front entrance, one at the lobby elevator, and then more at the parking and the pool. Plus, all the guests had digital key cards, so you could see the timestamps of when they like swiped it to get into their room. So on the morning of her assault, he wanted to figure out where she had been. So at 3:41 a.m., we see that she checked into her room using her key card, and then she was found about 3 hours later in the Everglades. So we have this 3-hour mystery window that we don't know what happened to her. So he uses the security cameras to try to figure it out. We know that she met up with a friend for dinner and got back around midnight, and then between the hours of midnight and 3, she was doing some stuff. And then at about 3 a.m., she left the hotel. We see it on the security footage, walked across the street to a gas station to get a phone card so that she could call her mom in Ukraine. She gets back, we see her on the security footage walking back into the lobby around 3:40, and she gets on the elevator around 3:41, and we see her talking to another individual, just a random guy, and then they both go up in the elevator. She swipes the time card to get into her room, and we see that she entered around 3:41. So now Ken Brennan goes to look at the footage and is trying to figure out how she ended up going from her room at 3:41 and leaving the hotel. And when he is looking at the footage, there is literally no evidence that she ever left. Like, she is not on a single frame, and she would have been if she left, if she walked out the door, if she was carried out, you would have seen her on the footage. So somehow this woman went from being in a room at 3:41 to the Everglades at around 7 a.m. and we have no idea how. Zero evidence she left the hotel except for the fact that she was found in the Everglades hours later. So he's looking at the cameras, and to preface, the cameras are used by motion detector. They are not running continuously, but anytime someone moves, even if they move slowly, even if they move like in weird ways or try to get around it, the motion detection will pick it up. They even tried to tamper with the motion detectors to see if you could somehow mess it up, and there's no way that the cameras would not record if someone was moving. So there's no way that someone tampered with the cameras. At first, they think a possibility is that someone dropped her out of the 4-foot story window into the bushes, and that's why she had all the bruises. But when they investigate, the bruises don't line up with that, and the bushes were not like flattened in any way. So they know that isn't the case. And they think maybe she was disguised. So Ken starts looking at all the different footage to try to see if she's disguised, and he starts looking at every single individual on the cameras that day, and there are a lot. There is so much traffic going in and out of this hotel. He starts eliminating anyone with a small bag, anyone who it's clear it couldn't be her disguised, anyone who couldn't be clearly carrying her or disguising her, he rules out. After the most tedious time looking at this footage, he finally has only one guy left, and it is the guy that she is seen chatting with on the elevator for like 2 seconds before they go up to the 4th floor. We see him enter the elevator at 3:41 with the victim. He was a large black man. He was about 6'4" and about 300 pounds. He wore glasses. So we see him enter the elevator at 3:41. And then when they go up to the 4th floor, there's no footage on the hallways or near the rooms. So we don't know where he went. He could have even gone to another floor. And then we see him exit the elevator and come back down to the lobby 2 hours later at 5:28 a.m. He is unaccompanied, but he is carrying a suitcase. The suitcase is like a rolling suitcase, so he's dragging it behind him, and he looks cool, calm, and collected. And now Ken Brennan is like, crap, because he's the only person left that I haven't ruled out, but he's just carrying a bag, and this bag doesn't look big enough to like fit a person inside of it. And not only that, but he looks so calm. Like there's no way that this guy is hauling a body in this bag. Fortunately, this guy, he is determined. We are now talking about her private investigator, Ken Brennan, who has eliminated every single person on the security footage except for one guy, and he is convinced that this is the guy. The problem is the guy that he is looking at is carrying a suitcase, and he is looking so calm. He is looking cool and collected. If you had just raped and assaulted someone, most people aren't looking this calm. Like they're sweaty, they're stressed. This guy looks like he is just about to go out for a nice little stroll of the day, and he's dragging the suitcase behind him like it weighs nothing. And yes, and granted, she was a small girl, and he is a huge guy. Like he's 300 pounds, 6'4", like he's a big guy. So something like, oh, a small woman's body wouldn't be the end of the world for him to drag behind him. But a body in a suitcase would still be a little bit heavy. And when he's first looking at the suitcase, he's like, I don't know that this suitcase would be big enough for her to fit in. But he figures out the dimensions of the suitcase based off of the video, and they test it out, and it turns out that she could have fit in it. He comes back without the suitcase 2 hours later. If you were just traveling by yourself, you wouldn't leave the hotel with a suitcase and then come back 2 hours later without your suitcase. That's weird. And the thing that Ken Brennan notices on the camera that is really the nail in the coffin, he knows this is the guy. He is pulling the suitcase off the elevator. This whole time, the guy made it seem like this suitcase was super light and he was just going for a stroll. But when he pulls the suitcase off the elevator, the wheels get kind of stuck between the elevator and the floor. And if it was light, it would just go right over that little gap in the floor. But if it's heavy, the wheel would kind of sink down into it and you'd have to tug it. And you see the guy, it's subtle, but you see him kind of struggle to tug the suitcase out of the elevator. So he's like, that suitcase isn't light, that thing is heavy. Now Ken is convinced, and he takes this to the detective Alan and says, I know that this is the guy. And Alan's coworkers are around, he's telling everyone about this, and they just kind of laugh him off. Alan is like, look, I don't think this is enough proof. I don't think this is right. And all the other coworkers just scoff at him and they say, yeah, right, buddy. So he's kind of hit a dead end. Because Ken isn't actually a cop, he's just a private investigator, he can't actually act on anything. So he can't go get a warrant or go interview this guy. Like, there's nothing he can really do. But this guy, Ken, he is determined, and he is set that this is the guy. And one thing about Ken is apparently he does not give up. So he decides to keep looking at the footage. He starts tracking this guy's like day-to-day activity from the days before, and he sees him walking out the door towards a restaurant one day in the security footage. So he goes to the restaurant and gets security footage from them. And at one point you can see on his t-shirt that it has letters on it. He blows the footage up and figures out the words on the t-shirt is Verado. And at first he doesn't know what that means. He's not sure what that could possibly mean. Is it another language? He doesn't know. And at first he's worried this could be a dead end. But he goes to Google and he searches the word, and it turns out it is an engine manufactured by Mercury Marine, and this is an engine for boats. And in February in Miami, there was a huge boat convention. So he goes and gets in contact with the people that ran the convention and asks who could have these t-shirts. And they say pretty much anyone who attended. So he's like, crap, that doesn't narrow it down. Months go by. He is meticulously looking over this footage. He is not giving up. The police have since moved on. And Ken is he is determined. Starts talking to contacts, trying to figure out if anyone knows this guy. Finally, through connections, he gets a name. It is Mike Jones. It's good news that he has a name, but the problem is Mike Jones is a very common name. There are probably 100 Mike Jones within that little area. So now, how is he going to narrow it down? So he gets access to the hotel logs and sees that Mike Jones had checked in February 14th, which was 7 days before the attack, and checked out February 22nd, which was the day after she was assaulted and the day after she was found. He gets access to the information of the card that was used on his account, and it was Michael Lee Jones. There was an address for West Virginia, but it turns out that he had been not in that address for years, and the card was no longer used. It had been canceled. But when he looked at the phone number that this Mike guy had left, it was under a business called Centerplate. And Centerplate is a hospitality and food service job. So this is something that if he worked there, it could be making him travel all over. And this could be the reason why this guy is so confident and calm after just raping and assaulting a woman. So he looks into the company Centerplate and discovers that he no longer works there, but he's like, he probably went to a competitor. So he looks at all the competitors in the area and gets 25 different businesses, and he calls every single one of them and says, hey, does this guy work for you? And all of them are happy to answer questions, and they're like, nope, that guy doesn't work for us. Is there anything else you need? Except for one company. And when he calls them, they say, get a subpoena and don't answer anything else. So Ken is like, yeah, that's the place. I know this is where he works. So he calls the detective and says, I've got a name. It is Mike Lee Jones. Come get him. So the detective doesn't know if he fully believes him, but he's like, you know what? This guy's done a lot of work. He's very confident. I'm going to at least humor him and go check it out. The detective and his partner go to check out Mike Lee Jones. So when he gets to where Mike is just sitting outside grilling. He seems cool and calm and collected. So they just start having a casual conversation. And he asks him if he had been to Miami anytime soon. He says yes. He said he stayed at that hotel, and he answers what they already knew. And then he asks if he had any sexual relationships with anyone while he was there. And Mike says, yeah, I slept with a German woman. He says, though, that it's consensual, because when the detective asks him if he raped anyone, he says, no, absolutely not, and acts appropriately surprised. Even though he's not convinced at this point that it's Mike, he gets some DNA and tests it against the DNA found on the victim when she was discovered. And turns out it matched. So the detective immediately calls the PI and is like, oh my God, you were right. I can't believe it. This is the guy, and we have to get him. So they arrest him, and he denies it, but he has a story. But eventually in the interrogation, they finally get his story to kind of crack, and he ends up making a plea deal. He is sentenced to 2 years, only 2 years, for a woman, beating her, putting her in a suitcase, and leaving her for dead in the Everglades. 2 years, that's it. So the PI is pissed. He is like, that's not good enough. And so he goes back and looks at records, and using FBI records, he looks at DNA and finds 3 other unsolved cases that match his DNA. And all I have to say is, if I ever have something happen to me, I want Ken Brennan to be my PI, because holy crap, this dude is committed and he does an amazing job. Of the 3 cases, 2 were in New Orleans and 1 was in Colorado. And one of them in New Orleans is able to give a very positive ID, and between that and the DNA, he is sentenced for 24 years to life for one of them and 12 to life for the other. Mike was 38 when he was charged. He won't have a possibility of parole till 2032, and because he's a repeat offender, he probably will never get